James Thompson had been working as a mail carrier for nearly 25 years. Every day, he walked the same familiar route through the quiet suburban neighborhoods of Maplewood, delivering letters, bills, and the occasional package. The houses on his route were mostly occupied by retirees, many of whom James had come to know personally over the years. He was more than just a mailman to these people. He was a familiar face, a kind smile, and sometimes the only person they spoke to all day. There was something comforting in the routine. The soft sound of the mail slot, the friendly waves from porch swings, the scent of freshly mowed grass, all stitched together to form the fabric of his daily life. But there was also an unsettling truth that James could never shake. Some of the people he delivered mail to were growing older, frailer, and more isolated with each passing year. One such person was Mrs. Evelyn Harris. She had lived in the same house on Elmwood Street for as long as James could remember. A widow in her late 80s, Mrs. Harris was known for her beautifully maintained garden that flourished in her front yard, a striking contrast to the peeling paint of her old house. Her roses were famous in the neighborhood, and despite her age, Evelyn had always prided herself on keeping her home beautiful. James admired her for that. But recently, he'd noticed that the garden wasn't looking as it once had. Overgrown weeds now encroached on the rose bushes, and the flowers, usually in full bloom, were wilting. Something was off. It had been days since James had seen Mrs. Harris outside, and that nagging sense that something wasn't right grew stronger with every visit. On a chilly Wednesday morning, as he walked up her driveway, James saw her for the first time in over a week. She was sitting on her porch swing, but her posture was slouched, her usually vibrant smile absent. She waved weakly as he approached, and as he got closer, James noticed something that made his heart drop. Stains, dark discolored patches, covered the lower part of her pants. They were unusual, almost like dried blood or some kind of fluid, and they stood out starkly against the pale fabric of her slacks. Evelyn seemed not to notice, or perhaps she was trying to pretend they weren't there. "Morning, Mrs. Harris," James said, forcing a smile as he handed her the mail. "It's been a while since I've seen you out here." She smiled faintly, but her eyes didn't carry the same warmth he was used to. "Oh, I've just been feeling a little under the weather, dear. Nothing to worry about." James hesitated, glancing again at the stains. "Are you sure you're all right? Those pants? Looks like you might have had an accident." Evelyn looked down at her pants, her face flushing with embarrassment. She tugged at the fabric as if trying to hide the stains. "Oh, yes, just a little spill in the kitchen. I'm fine, really." Her voice was thin, strained. Something wasn't right. James nodded slowly, but the concern gnawing at him wouldn't go away. "All right, well, if you ever need anything, you just let me know, okay?" She nodded, but her gaze had already drifted off, as if she were somewhere far away. As James continued on his route, the image of Evelyn's stained pants and her distant expression lingered in his mind. His gut told him something was wrong. He had seen her decline over the past few months, and though he wasn't one to intrude, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Harris was in serious trouble. By the time he reached the last house on his route, James had made up his mind. He had to do something. Later that afternoon, James found himself standing outside Mrs. Harris's house again, this time without mail in hand. He hesitated at the gate, glancing up at the second-floor windows, all of which were closed with the blinds drawn. He could smell something faint in the air, something sour like garbage left out too long. James knocked gently on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, his heart rate picking up as he strained to hear any movement inside. After a long pause, there was a faint shuffling from the other side of the door. When the door finally creaked open, Evelyn appeared, looking worse than before. Her face was pale, her skin almost gray, and her movements were sluggish. The same stains still marred her pants, but now there was a distinct, pungent odor coming from the house. Something rotten, something deeply unsettling. "James, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Harris, but I wanted to check on you. You don't seem well." She smiled weakly, but said nothing. Behind her, the hallway was dim, the air thick and stale. He could see into the living room, where piles of newspapers and mail were scattered across the floor. A plate with old, half-eaten food sat on the armrest of her recliner, and there were empty bottles of prescription pills on the coffee table. James swallowed hard. "Mrs. Harris, are you sure you're okay? Maybe I should call someone to check on you." No, she said quickly, stepping forward, though it looked like every step took great effort. "I don't need anyone. I'm just fine. Just a little tired, that's all." Her insistence only deepened James's concern. He didn't want to push, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. As Evelyn stepped aside to close the door, James caught a glimpse of something that stopped him cold. A dark red smear on the floor near the base of the staircase. It looked fresh. His heart pounded in his chest. "Mrs. Harris," he said, his voice tight with alarm. "What happened inside? Is that blood?" She followed his gaze, her face going pale. "Oh, that. No, it's just a spill." James took a deep breath. He couldn't leave her like this. Something had happened, and she wasn't telling him the full truth. But he also knew she wouldn't let him in or ask for help, no matter how much she needed it. "I'm going to call someone," he said firmly. "You need help." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes wide and panicked. "No, please, James, don't. I'll be fine, really." But James had made up his mind. He turned and walked away, pulling out his phone as he hurried back to the sidewalk. He dialed 911, his hands trembling as he explained the situation. When the police and paramedics arrived, James stood by the front gate, watching anxiously as they entered Mrs. Harris's house. He felt a knot of guilt in his stomach for going against her wishes, but deep down, he knew it was the right thing to do. A few minutes later, one of the paramedics came back outside, a grim expression on her face. "You did the right thing by calling us," she said softly. "Mrs. Harris is in a bad state. She's severely dehydrated and malnourished. It looks like she's been living in terrible conditions for a while now." James felt his throat tighten. He had known something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. "And the stains?" he asked, dreading the answer. The paramedic hesitated before speaking. "It appears she had an accident. She's been struggling to move around the house. The blood, well, she must have fallen recently. We're going to take her to the hospital. She needs proper care." James stood there, numb, watching as they carefully helped Mrs. Harris onto a stretcher and loaded her into the ambulance. She looked so small and fragile, lying there with her eyes closed, as if the weight of her years had finally caught up with her. As the ambulance drove away, James felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. How had things gotten so bad? How had no one noticed? The days that followed were quiet. James went back to his regular route, delivering mail as usual, but he couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Harris from his mind. He visited the hospital a few times to check on her, but she was weak, too weak to talk much. He learned from the doctors that Mrs. Harris had been living in isolation for years, slowly deteriorating in her home. Her only son had passed away years ago, and with no other family, she had been left to fend for herself. The neighborhood, though friendly enough, had failed to notice the signs of her decline. A week after his visit to the hospital, James received a small note in his mailbox. It was from Mrs. Harris, written in shaky, barely legible handwriting. "Thank you, James. I didn't realize how far I'd fallen until you helped me. I owe you my life. Bless you." Tears welled up in James's eyes as he read the note. He had done what anyone should have done, but knowing that he had made a difference in Mrs. Harris's life, perhaps even saved her, filled him with both sadness and gratitude. As the weeks turned into months, Mrs. Harris's condition improved, though her frailty was still apparent. The once solitary widow now had a small group of neighbors who visited regularly, some bringing groceries, others tending to her garden or simply sitting with her for a chat. The transformation of her house was remarkable. The once overgrown yard now bloomed with vibrant roses and daisies. The hedges were neatly trimmed, and a fresh coat of paint was applied to her front porch, courtesy of the community. James visited her often, as he had become a frequent part of her days. What started as brief conversations turned into long, reflective talks. There was something about their time together that felt necessary, almost fated. James realized that his daily visits weren't just for Mrs. Harris anymore. He needed them too. One rainy afternoon, after finishing his mail route, James dropped by as usual. Mrs. Harris greeted him with a warmth in her eyes that had been absent in the months before her collapse. She had regained a bit of weight, and though she still moved slowly, she no longer looked as though she might fall apart at any moment. The house, now filled with the smell of freshly brewed tea, felt cozy and lived in, not the cold, lonely shell it had once been. "James, you've been such a blessing," she said as they sat together in her small living room. She placed a cup of tea in front of him, her hands still slightly shaky. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't called for help that day." James shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to such praise, especially for something he believed anyone should have done. He glanced around the room, taking in the photos of her late husband and son that lined the mantelpiece. The room had a quiet sadness to it, as if it had seen too many losses and had grown used to mourning. "Anyone would have done it," he said softly, though deep down, he wasn't sure if that was true. Mrs. Harris looked at him with knowing eyes, her expression soft but serious. "I'm not so sure about that. It's easy to go through life without noticing the people who fade into the background, especially old women like me. You've seen it, haven't you? People who walk by, never stopping to ask if we're all right, never thinking twice. You didn't just see me, James. You cared." James's throat tightened at her words. He had always tried to be the kind of person who looked out for others, but in that moment, he realized how rare it was for people to be acknowledged in such a simple, human way. How often had he walked by houses on his route without thinking about the lives inside them, without considering the loneliness or the quiet suffering that might be hidden behind closed doors? I couldn't ignore it," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I saw those stains on your pants, I knew something was wrong. And when I saw inside your house, I couldn't just walk away." Mrs. Harris smiled, though there was a sadness in it. "You did more than you know. I was in such a dark place, James. After my husband passed, and then my son, I didn't think I could go on. The days blurred together, and before I knew it, I had stopped caring about myself, about the house, about everything. I thought I could manage, but I was wrong." James nodded, listening closely. He had often wondered about her son, whom he had never met. He hesitated for a moment, not wanting to pry, but his curiosity got the better of him. "What happened to your son, if you don't mind me asking?" Mrs. Harris sighed deeply, her gaze drifting toward a photo of a young man in military uniform, his eyes bright with youth and hope. She seemed to age 10 years in the few seconds it took her to respond. "Jonathan," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He was my pride and joy. He joined the army right after high school, wanted to serve his country. I was so proud of him, even though it terrified me. He was stationed overseas, in Iraq. He came back different. The things he saw, the things he did, they haunted him. Her voice cracked, and she paused, wiping at her eyes with a trembling hand. He was never the same. He tried to hide it, but I knew. One night, after he came back home, he took his own life. I found him in his room, and I knew then that I had lost him long before that night. He was gone long before I found his body. James felt his heart shatter at her words. He had never known this part of her story, had never imagined the depth of the grief she carried. He reached out, gently placing his hand on hers. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Harris. I had no idea." She nodded, her eyes distant. "It's not something I talk about much, but it changed me. I stopped caring about everything. The house, my health, none of it mattered anymore. I just existed until you came that day. I thought I didn't need anyone, that I could handle it all on my own. But I was wrong. I was dying, James, and I didn't even realize it." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. James sat silently, absorbing the enormity of what she had been through. He had known she was struggling, but he hadn't realized just how close she had come to giving up entirely. And now, as he sat across from her, he realized that their connection went beyond simple kindness. They had both been searching for something, for someone, to give them purpose again. As their conversations grew deeper, James found himself sharing more of his own story with Mrs. Harris. He had always been a private person, not one to talk about his personal life with anyone, let alone someone on his mail route. But there was something about Mrs. Harris that made him feel safe, as though she understood things that others didn't. One afternoon, after they had discussed her son and the profound grief that still haunted her, Mrs. Harris turned the conversation to James. "You know, James, you're always so kind to everyone on your route," she said, sipping her tea. "But I've noticed that there's a sadness in your eyes. You've been carrying something for a long time, haven't you?" James looked down at his hands, the question catching him off guard. He hadn't expected her to see through him so easily, but she was right. There was something he had been carrying for years, something he rarely spoke about. "My wife," he said quietly, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "She passed away 5 years ago. Cancer. It was fast. Too fast." Mrs. Harris's eyes filled with understanding, the kind of empathy that only comes from someone who has known deep loss. "I'm so sorry, James. I didn't know." "It's okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if it really was. "I don't talk about it much. I guess I just shut down after it happened. I threw myself into work, into the routine. It was easier that way. But after she died, everything felt empty. Even now, it's hard to feel like anything matters. Delivering the mail, walking the same streets every day. Sometimes it feels like I'm just going through the motions." Mrs. Harris reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I understand that feeling more than you know. Losing someone you love, it's like a part of you dies with them. But you're still here, James. You're still making a difference even when you don't realize it." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For the first time in years, James felt a glimmer of hope, a faint light breaking through the fog of his grief. He had spent so long believing that he was just going through the motions, that his life had lost its meaning. But here, with Mrs. Harris, he saw that even the smallest acts of kindness could have a profound impact. As word spread through the neighborhood about Mrs. Harris's condition and James's role in helping her, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves started reaching out to one another. People began checking in on the elderly residents more frequently, offering to run errands or help with yard work. It was as though James's simple act of compassion had sparked a ripple effect throughout the community. One morning, As James was delivering mail, a woman named Karen approached him outside her house. She was one of the newer residents, a busy mother of two who rarely had time to stop and chat. "James, I just wanted to say thank you," Karen said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I heard about what you did for Mrs. Harris, and it's made me realize how much I've been taking my neighbors for granted. I've lived here for 5 years, and I barely know the people who live around me. I'm ashamed of that. But after hearing what you did, I'm going to make more of an effort. Thank you for reminding us what community really means." James smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. He hadn't set out to change the neighborhood, but it seemed that his actions had done just that. Over the next few weeks, small changes became evident all around Maplewood. People waved to each other more, stopped for conversations, and looked out for one another in ways they hadn't before. The isolation that had once defined the neighborhood began to dissipate, replaced by a renewed sense of connection. And in the middle of it all was Mrs. Harris, no longer the forgotten widow in the overgrown house, but a cherished member of the community. Surrounded by people who cared, months passed, and as the leaves began to turn from green to gold, Mrs. Harris's health continued to improve. She had regained much of her strength, and with the help of her neighbors and James, her home had been transformed into a place of warmth and life once again. One afternoon, as James sat with her on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sun set over the horizon, Mrs. Harris turned to him with a smile. "You know, James," she said softly, "you didn't just save my life that day. You gave me a reason to live again. You reminded me that there's still goodness in the world, even when things seem darkest." James looked at her, his heart full of gratitude and admiration. "You've done the same for me, Mrs. Harris, more than you know." In that moment, they both understood that their connection went beyond simple friendship. It was a bond forged in loss and healing, in the shared experience of finding hope again after unimaginable grief. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the neighborhood, they knew that this was just the beginning of something new, a second chance at life, for both of them. The story of James and Mrs. Harris is one of compassion, resilience, and the profound impact that even the smallest acts of kindness can have on a person's life. Through their shared experiences of loss, they found healing in one another, reminding us all that no matter how isolated or forgotten we may feel, there is always someone willing to care, to listen, and to help us find our way back to the light. The simple act of noticing, of caring, of reaching out, can change the course of a life. And sometimes, as James learned, it can even change an entire community.